Combination of robotics and AI, that's sort of a game changer, right, in terms of what can happen. I think you're going to see some fairly big changes in the next 5 years or so. But it's also important, I think, to bear in mind, this is a big industry globally, but it's a big ecosystem because you have...
We all exit our company eventually. The question is, will it be on your terms or someone else's? Strategy matters. Timing matters. The right partner changes everything. Brought to you by Meritage Partners. Here is your host, Brian Franco, author of The Inevitable Exit. This is the M&A Guy Podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the M&A Guy Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Franco, founder and CEO of Meritage and recent author of The Inevitable Exit. I encourage you to take a look at our 10 deal killer list that you should definitely take a look at. It's a free gift from us to you. You can find that at inevitableexit.com. Today is a very special guest. Not only a guest, he's one of my partners here at Meritage Partners. He joined the firm here just about a month ago, and he is leading the charge in the world of automated manufacturing and technology. Mr. Michael Pring. I call him Mike, but
I'm Mike.
I like Mike. Hey, Mike. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, nice to see you this afternoon.
Yeah, it's good to see you
Beautiful day here.
Yeah, I know. We're usually interacting remotely. I'm traveling somewhere or coming back from somewhere.
Yeah, right.
But it's good to be here in person.
Yeah, this is good.
It's a beautiful Friday here in Newport Beach, and about time we get out to playing a bit here.
Right.
So, but Mike, I wanted you to come on the podcast in this specific episode, just really to let the world know what you're doing. And and I could tell, I mean, like I said, we see where the industry is going, and we see, and you and I have been in many meetings recently with investors that are seeking investments in the space that you've been servicing for over 30 years.
Right.
Can you talk to me a little bit about, and tell the audience a little bit about your background and history?
Yeah, so I'm an engineer by background. Actually worked in the oil industry initially out of university. But for the last 30 years, I've been involved in industrial technology, industrial software. So working with pretty much every industry vertical, manufacturing, chemicals, refining, whatever. And I think the interesting trend during that time is the reliance people have on technology has really increased. Back 30 years ago, we were barely using Windows on the factory floor, but we've come a long way since then. And I think that if you look today at the challenges that manufacturers have, they're fairly common in terms of everyone's trying to drive productivity, efficiency, sustainability is a big issue, reducing energy consumption. And we have an aging workforce in manufacturing, particularly in the United States. So, trying to capture the knowledge becomes very important. So I think manufacturers and people in industry have looked to technology as being an enabler, because if you want to be more efficient, it's not work harder, it's work smarter. By working smarter is to kind of apply the technology.
Yeah.
And I think it's come a long way.
Yeah.
In terms of the capabilities that we have today.
It has. It definitely has. I remember a story my father was sharing with me when he used to work for FlexiVan. And FlexiVan, for those that don't know, they're the chassis of what they put containers on when ships come in.
Right.
And so his job at that warehouse was to manage the crews that they would walk around with a clipboard and write down what's the product number, what's the inventory on the box, and they would jot it all down, and they would take it and plug it into their computer. Yeah. And he was like, well, gosh, there's got to be a more efficient way to do this. And so he had this vision of, like, when you go to a grocery store and you have the, what do they call them? Tellers? What do they call the grocery store? Clerk.
The clerks, yeah.
And so he ended up setting, like, at each bay door, right, he set up the equivalent of like a checkout stand. And so he had someone with a 9-key digit, and they would come in and they would key in the digits, the quantity, and they would put all of the inputs in right on the spot. Yeah. And there was really, and back then the computers were, I never saw these, but they were basically hole punch cards with, is how they programmed them, right? Yeah. So then
I remember those days.
Yeah. If someone dropped those, you're starting over.
The old IBM mainframe days.
Yeah, exactly. So, but we've come a long way from that, right? And so we're seeing more domestic manufacturing, or more manufacturing coming back domestically. And so, we have, obviously, there's labor shortage, but then there's also need for, even if we had the labor, it's not the most efficient way to process, whether it's food or goods or whatever it may be. Where do you see the future going in terms of automated manufacturing and control devices? And where do you think we're going to see more of that? Do you think we're going to see that change much, or you think we're just going to utilize it more?
I think all of those. I think it's certainly going to change. I think we're at a little bit of an inflection point right now I think that we're seeing something of an acceleration, both in terms of adoption. And adoption is important because this is a fairly conservative industry. If you're running a chemical plant or a refinery or a warehouse, you're not likely to do something that's sort of cutting edge, right? So it's a fairly conservative industry, but I think the technologies have been fairly well proven over a long period of time. So I think customers are looking at it and saying, yeah, I see the benefit. And I think customers are very much driven by the bottom line, right? It's what's the return on investment? If I can spend the money and get a return in 2 years, that's probably a good way to spend the money. So I think that's driving it in terms of a demand perspective. I think the technology is advancing. The hardware has become somewhat cheaper over time, obviously, servers and whatever. But I think the technology changes are also important as well. I mean, we have a lot more cloud enablement today, a lot more being done in the cloud. We obviously have AI, which is a whole huge subject unto itself, but I think we're starting to see how AI or the prudent use of AI can actually help drive productivity and efficiency. We're seeing a lot with robotics, and particularly if you have the combination of robotics and AI, that's a sort of a game changer, right, in terms of what can happen. Because then you start to get autonomous robotics. So a lot of possibilities there. So yeah, I think you're going to see some fairly big changes in the next 5 years or so. But it's also important, I think, to bear in mind that, this is a big industry globally, but it's a big ecosystem because you have people that make hardware, you have people that build software, you have people that distribute, you have people that integrate, you have people consult. So there's a whole range of different parts that make all this work. So I think all of those are probably seeing, I think, some encouraging signs, I think, for the future in terms of how that business is going to grow. So I think, obviously with AI, a lot of the focus is on what it does in the office, like with ChatGPT and how it makes the office worker, the people who are essentially knowledge workers more productive. But if you think about where AI meets the physical world, that's a whole different thing in terms of what the impact of that could be, which, we're beginning to see the start of, but I think that's profound. I think we will see some profound changes.
Yeah, I was having a conversation last week with a group that created some technology that really uses IoT, Internet of Things, to connect with various devices in a call it, manufacturing plant. It in this case, it was automotive, but it could be anything. They could apply this tool to anything. And what they discovered was you have, assets in a warehouse. You have the warehouse itself. You have the automated devices and tools and robotics. You have the humans or the human assets in there as well. Right. And then you have the technology that is threading all of this together. And so what they found is that AI can make real-time measurement around the clock. And so in a typical setting of an organization, you'll have your head of HR, you'll have your COO or head of production, you'll have head engineer that's maintaining all the robotics. And how often do these people in an organization sit down and strategize? How many times do they sit down and communicate, right? At least quarterly, you would think. But with AI, it could happen as, multiple times per hour. Multiple times per second, right? Just depending on how it's configured. And I think we're going to find that, those sorts of tools are going to help us become better doing the things we're doing, just like the knowledge worker or the office worker. We're going to see that in manufacturing. Do you think that's going to be both? I gave you a case study of automotive. Do you think that's going to move into, consumer goods, to food, to beverage? Or do you think it's just more isolated to automotive or aerospace as an example?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, as I've looked at it, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, as I've looked at it, and you look at those industries, maybe have some uniqueness in terms of what they do. So if you take automotive, it's sort of discrete parts, it's making discrete parts and doing assembly. Aerospace is kind of a similar concept, except it's somewhat more regulated. But then you have people that, that make chocolate bars, and they want to make chocolate bars in the most efficient way they can. You have people that run chemical plants. The concepts are the same. IoT applies across all of those. The Internet of Things applies across all of those. The specific technologies may be a little bit different, but I think the concepts are the same. So I think, no, it's not just automotive. I think it's across a lot of industries we're actually seeing this. I spent a good deal of my career actually working with food and beverage companies, and they were very keen to put this technology in place because they have other requirements like traceability.
Correct.
If you're making vats of chocolate, making chocolate bars, you need to know where they go and if there's a problem, how you recall them.
Correct.
So all that stuff's important. So I think this tends to be sort of very much cross-industry. I think the dynamics in certain verticals are a little bit different, but the dynamics are all positive, I think, in terms of where they're going.
So do you think that because of the traceability related to, let's call it food and beverage, but
or pharmaceuticals,
also pharma, right? Pharmaceuticals,
medical device,
medical devices. Are you seeing that same sort of process and transparency adapted in consumer goods as well?
Yeah, consumer packaged goods, they have similar issues. Certainly food and beverage, we've talked about, they have issues there. I think transportation, warehousing, you mentioned warehousing, that's an area where there's a lot of opportunity because we've had automated guided vehicles for a long time, these automated warehouses. Now we have more autonomous robotics where they can figure out how they don't clash with each other and almost can move in free time, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
But also, logistics and supply chain are important things. So you think about the complexity of some of these supply chains. So supply chain optimization, logistics, transportation, you put all that together, almost from getting raw materials, manufacturing something, shipping it, getting it off to your subcontractors and whatever. Right. That's a very complex operation. And the question is, how well optimized is it? Probably not. Right. So then you say, well, look, you can apply software to that. And that's potentially where AI comes in, because what AI can do is look at it and say, it can help you look at different scenarios, different use cases, and figure out how to optimize how that works. So no, I see it as it's different, but I see it as similar concepts being applied across different industries.
Interesting. Yeah. And you and I have had a couple recent meetings, and you've had additional meetings with investors in the marketplace that are looking for these types of investments. We've seen, debt players, we've seen equity players, just gravitating to these sorts of opportunities. What can you tell, from your experience from these meetings? What do you see investors mostly want? What's the common theme of what they're looking for, or is there not a common thing?
I would say there's a lot of themes.
Okay, very good.
Which is good. I like that. I like different themes. I think we've seen recently a number of investors that are looking more at the hardware aspect. So if you take industrial automation, it starts with hardware. Yeah. It starts with flow control. It starts with valves. It starts with stuff like that. And I think that in those industries, which are for the most part probably pretty well established, I think the opportunities there are with roll up. Right? How can you take some smaller businesses, roll them up, and create, an increased value proposition? So I think some people are looking at that, and I think potentially also looking at how you can build more than just one part of that business. So, for example, if you were looking at a particular business like water, wastewater, how can you put the pieces together to offer more to the customer? Because I think an important thing to bear in mind is the complexity for the consumer, the customer, of how you purchase this. And if you're running a facility and you've got 20 different suppliers supplying different things, that's a complex situation. So if you're an investor and you've pulled some of these together, you can go to the client and say, look, we can provide all the piece parts or a good number of the piece parts and the services and the post-sale support. That's a very strong value proposition. It improves the responsiveness of the customer. Potentially, it takes some costs out as well. So I think that's very attractive. I think software is obviously an attractive area, typically because the EBITDA, the profitability on software companies is going to be higher. So I think, again, people are looking at different parts of the software business. I think the interesting part there is I think if you take the software business, it's about a $160 billion industry globally.
Wow.
So it's not small.
Yeah.
And the question is, what do you want to focus on? There are a lot of different pieces to that. So I think individual investors have a particular thesis based on a particular part of that industry. Maybe you don't want to go up against the big boys, but maybe you want to complement, the large players and find some niche parts of that business. And I think there are a lot of smaller companies. I think globally, something like 6,000 or 7,000 small software companies in the space. So there's a lot of companies out there that are, in it, 5 million to 40, 50 million. Yeah. But you say, okay, well, those are opportunities that you potentially can acquire and grow and then merge those companies together. Yeah. So I think that's another part of it. I think people get excited also with the new technology. So AI, I think that's attractive because people see growth there. I think digital twin is something, and you sort of alluded to it earlier, because if you have a physical plan and you have a digital model, essentially you have a digital twin, and that's very appealing. And then I think the people aspect as well. So we talk about how you connected work, how you have software to connect the worker and the knowledge and the assets together. And I think that's attractive as well. So, and then that's just the sort of the product side of it. Then if you were to take the distribution portion of it, that's another area that people have an interest in, because I think distributors, particularly in software, tend to be fairly profitable businesses that are well established. Again, there's opportunities for acquiring those, one at a time or roll up. And there's a whole integrator community out there as well. So I would say investors are spoiled for choice, really. I mean, I think it's like there's a lot to go after. Yeah. And I think it's a question of figuring out what makes sense from an investment thesis viewpoint. What is it that you want to concentrate on? And I think that's potentially, where we can help as well.
Yeah, I agree.
In terms of focus.
We found that we're already doing that in certain circumstances, and we're essentially intersecting the opportunities that we advise on with those in the market. I think it's a mixed bag too. I agree. We see those that are hyper focused in food and beverage, others are in aerospace, others in automotive, and the list goes on. But ultimately, the theme there is they're looking to consolidate what it is a segmented industry at some aspect.
Yeah.
Because the players here, right? These players very well, but they've been doing things the same way they've been doing for the last 20, 30 years.
Mm-hmm. It is segmented. I mean, you've got some large players both on the sort of hardware side and the software side. But I think, I came from the software side of this business working for some fairly large companies. And I think the thing you have to remember is even when you're very large, you can't do everything.
True.
Nobody covers the whole spectrum. It's just not possible.
That's right.
There's always going to be gaps. So I think from an investment viewpoint, if you take what the large players are doing, the attractiveness there is, well, how do you take advantage of their ecosystem? I mean, how do you invest in something that's sort of complementary to that rather than being competitive to that? And I think that's where a lot of the investment focus for private equity tends to be, is sort of in that space. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of room. I mean, I think while there's a lot of players, I think there's a lot of potential opportunities still.
And some of your peers in the industry or people that you met along the way that, have, let's say, a sub, $50 million business, a revenue business a year, call it, 5 to 50 million.
Yeah.
These companies have a unique proposition in the market, but you and I have also seen that they're not necessarily, their kids aren't, lining up at the door waiting to take over the company either.
That's true.
Right.
Right.
And so, and then, those that they're working with, their leaders are later in their career as well. And so the question is, who are they passing the torch off to? And so I think private equities and family offices and independent sponsors are well positioned to step into those businesses and really advance them in ways that carries on the legacy of what the businesses are and were, but also allows them to consolidate and provides for vertical integration, which customers and clients want, right? Yeah. If you're just selling the bottle cap, that's one vendor, and you're the bottle, that's another. More and more suppliers and buyers want to buy a fully, built product or whatever it may be, right? I just thought about caps and bottles. Like those were scarcities, 5 years ago, right?
Right.
And you could have all the caps in the world, but no bottles,
no bottles,
vice versa,
yeah, exactly.
Right? And I think that those types of investment groups are well positioned in this market. And I think we're going to see a lot of advancements over the next 10 years, specifically in consolidation and more further, in those vertically integrated companies.
Yeah, and I think if you were to take distribution as an example, and bear in mind, I think if you look at the larger companies that are involved in industrial automation, manufacturing, hardware and software, they have both a direct and an indirect sales model. Because on the one hand, you have a volume business, but also you have a strategic business. So whether you're selling widgets or whether you're selling control valves or flow controllers or whether they're selling software. Yeah. There's a volume business, and some of that, is orders of sub $10,000. But you also have corporate customers who an order maybe millions of dollars. And you need an efficient way of managing that. So very often, it's split between direct and indirect. So the distribution channel has an important role. I quite often get asked, is that challenged now with cloud? And I think the answer is not exactly, because these guys aren't really people with boxes on shelves anymore. They're really people. They're really value-added resellers. I mean, they understand the business. They have customer relationships. They're kind of extension of the sales team. So they still have a very valuable role to play. Mm-hmm. And I think those customer relationships are critical. Because if you're looking at, say, a distributor that's been working with customers 20, 25 years, and they have those personal relationships, that's tremendously valuable, particularly if they're selling a well-established product line. Similarly with integrators, integrators often are regional, they have a customer base, they're trusted, they're often the first point of contact. Because in this business, quite often, a customer isn't going to go to the supplier. They're going to go to their integrator and say, I want to build a project. So what should I use? And the integrator will say, well, you need X, Y, Z, and we should get it from this supplier. So that's often how these relationships come about. So I think that's where this whole ecosystem is kind of important. And, from an investment viewpoint, I think it just increases the number of options of parts that you can focus on. And maybe it's a combination of those things. I mean, it could be partly on the the product side and partly on the distribution side and partly on the integration side.
Yeah.
So there are many combinations of valuable things that could be done here.
Yeah.
So it's exciting.
It is exciting. We're excited to have you on board with the firm, and we're off to a great start.
Thank
We
you.
got the announcements out there to the world, but for those that are in these industries and they want to reach out to you, of course, they could find you on LinkedIn and or at meritage-partners.com. I'd love for them to connect with you to learn more. You can learn more about them, and they can learn more about you and the services we're providing from the standpoint of exit planning and mergers and acquisitions, execution, and taking these clients to market. You and I are already off to a good start. I'm working on a couple of projects. I'll update you on a meeting I have next week, which is actually in a consumer goods product, consumable product, and cleaning agents and things as such. But
Excellent.
yeah. But thanks for being on, spending the time with me, and let's crush it next year.
Thank you, Brian. And I look forward to talking to any of the audience here that are interested in having a conversation, because it is a two-way conversation about,
It is.
What are they interested in? How can we help them with all your experience over 20 years with helping companies exit and having a great process for doing it? I think it's a winning combination.
It's a winning combination. That's why we're here together. Yeah.
Excellent.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you. And thank you for listening in and tuning in to this episode of the M&A Guy Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Franco. We will see you next week on the next episode. Until then, keep building your empire.